They called it erosion control. I called it premeditated hydro-sabotage, an act of such bureaucratic malice it bordered on the operatic. And they performed it on my land, in my creek, the one my grandfather, a man who understood the subtle language of water far better than any overzealous homeowners association president, taught me to read like a sacred text. He'd shown me where the trout hid in the summer shade and how the winter rains would sculpt the banks, a gentle give and take. They, in their infinite wisdom gleaned from glossy pamphlets on suburban harmony, decided the creek needed a gag order of riprap and gravel. Tons of it, dumped unceremoniously where the wild mint grew. They didn't know that creek was the last unspoiled artery of a watershed I'd mapped in my previous life. A life involving topographical surveys and fluid dynamic simulations that would make their heads spin. A life they couldn't possibly comprehend from behind their meticulously manicured, drought-intolerant lawns and their fierce, unwavering belief in the absolute righteousness of their bylaws. Karen Henderson, HOA president, reigning queen of the cul-de-sac covenants, had already tested the waters, so to speak. A politely worded notice about the precise allowable shade of beige from my mailbox. A passive-aggressive memo regarding the strategic deployment of recycling bins on Tuesdays. Petty skirmishes, easily parried with cold, concise compliance. This, however, this was different. This was an invasion. I stood on my side of the property line, the deed clutched in my hand like a forgotten treaty, and watched their hired goons, faces blank with the apathy of hourly labor, upend another truckload. The air filled with the grating sound of displaced stone, a sound that echoed the grinding in my jaw. Karen watched from her pristine SUV, a smug little smile playing on her lips, the kind that says, "I am the law, and your riparian rights are but a quaint suggestion." She probably thought this was just another Tuesday, another minor victory in her endless campaign for absolute neighborhood conformity. She didn't see the tremor in my hand wasn't fear, but the current of a different kind of flood, one building deep within the bedrock of my patience. They had, quite simply, picked the wrong creek, and by extension, the wrong man. The water, even now, was starting to pool unnaturally against their ill-conceived barrier. It was a warning. They were too busy admiring their handiwork to notice. The gravel lay like a scar across the creek bed, an ugly gray dam where clear water once danced over smooth stones. My initial approach was one of reasoned discourse, a tactic I knew, even as I dialed Karen Henderson's number, was likely futile. "Karen," I began, my voice carefully modulated to betray none of the cold fury simmering beneath. "The gravel your crew dumped in the creek behind my property is causing a significant obstruction. It's also, I might add, on my property." Her laugh was like ice cubes clinking in an empty glass. "Oh, Mr. Davies, always so dramatic. It's for erosion control, dear. Approved by the board. It'll settle. The creek needs taming, you know. All that wildness. It's just not tidy. Tidy." She wanted to make a force of nature tidy. I explained, patiently, about water displacement, about the natural flow paths, about the increased risk of upstream flooding, which, ironically, would primarily affect her side of the neighborhood, the newer, lower-lying section. I mentioned the ecological impact, the disruption to the small ecosystem my grandfather had cherished. She countered with talk of property values and aesthetic uniformity. It was like arguing with a beautifully painted, utterly unyielding brick wall. I followed up with a formal letter, CCing the entire HOA board, complete with diagrams and citations from local water management ordinances. I highlighted the specific violations of my property rights and the potential liabilities they were incurring. The response was a curt, dismissive email from Karen, stating the HOA stood by its decision and considered the matter closed. "We appreciate your input," it read, a masterpiece of insincere corporate speak. "But the Beautification Committee's findings are final." Beautification. They were choking a living waterway and calling it a makeover. This wasn't just about rocks in a stream. It was about a fundamental breach of covenant, not the HOA's flimsy, self-serving one, but the unspoken agreement between a man and the land that sustains him. It was a declaration that my rights, my heritage, the very ecological integrity of my property, were subordinate to their whims. The line hadn't just been crossed. It had been obliterated with a payload of crushed stone and an avalanche of sheer, unadulterated arrogance. My son, who loved to search for crayfish in that creek, came to me later, his face a mask of confusion. "Daddy, why did they fill our creek with rocks?" How do you explain calculated stupidity to a 7-year-old? You don't. You fix it. Or, in this case, you allow it to unfix itself, spectacularly. The time for pleasantries had been washed away with the first shovelful of their community improvement. Now began the meticulous collection of their sins, a task I approached with the detached precision of a forensic accountant examining a fraudulent ledger. The dormant authority within me, the part that understood hydrostatic pressure and the brutal calculus of consequence, began to stir. My previous life, the one before I sought the quiet solace of this valley, had involved designing systems to manage water, not to weaponize its neglect, but the principles were transferable. I pulled out my old survey maps, the ones annotated with my grandfather's spidery handwriting, and cross-referenced them with current county GIS data. The creek, their drainage ditch, as Karen once contemptuously called it, was a critical outflow for nearly 50 acres of upstream watershed. Their gravel dam, strategically incompetent, sat at a natural bottleneck. It was, to put it mildly, an engineering marvel of impending disaster. Old Man Hemlock, the retired meteorologist who lived 2 doors down from me on my side of the creek, the drier, slightly more elevated side, became an unwitting, then enthusiastic ally. Hemlock, a man whose conspiracy theories usually involve chemtrails and rogue weather balloons, had an almost supernatural knack for predicting local rainfall patterns. "That gravel pile, son," he'd cackled, pointing a gnarled finger from his porch, "that there's what we call a self-correcting problem, waiting for a good downpour. Karen thinks she's playing God with a wheelbarrow. God tends to have the last laugh, and it usually sounds like thunder." He also, quite helpfully, had a high-definition trail cam he'd once used to try and capture footage of a mythical black panther. He was more than happy to reposition it for a clear view of the creek. "For posterity," he said with a wink. I began documenting everything. Daily photographs of the rising water levels behind the gravel, even after minor showers, copies of my correspondence, their dismissive replies, printouts of rainfall forecasts from 3 different meteorological services. I even took core samples of the gravel, noting its inappropriate grade for any legitimate erosion control in such a dynamic waterway. It was too fine, too densely packed. It would act like concrete once saturated. They thought it was just dirt. They didn't understand the physics of water, or the tenacity of a man who had meticulously planned urban drainage systems designed to withstand 100-year floods. They were about to get a practical demonstration. My warnings became more formal, more pointed, like aiming stakes into the heart of their delusion. Certified letters, return receipts requested, were dispatched to Karen Henderson and each member of the HOA board. These weren't emotional pleas. They were cold, factual recitations of hydrological principles, local ordinances they were flouting, and the explicit, foreseeable consequences of their actions. I included photographs showing the initial water backup, the discolored vegetation already beginning to suffer. I even attached a hydrology report I'd commissioned, from myself, naturally, but presented with all the sterile authority of an independent consultant. The language was dense with terms like hydraulic impedance, floodplain encroachment, and potential tortious liability. I doubted Karen understood half of it, but the intent was clear. This was not a suggestion. It was a documented prelude to a reckoning. The HOA meeting convened, as it always did, in the clubhouse, a monument to beige conformity. I didn't attend. Hemlock did, ostensibly for the free cookies, but actually as my eyes and ears. He reported back that Karen, resplendent in a lime green pantsuit that did her complexion no favors, had waved my letter in the air like a captured enemy flag. "Mr. Davies, she'd announced, her voice a sharpened trowel digging into common sense, "is being alarmist and, frankly, unneighborly. This gravel is a vast improvement. Several residents have complimented us on how much tidier the water feature looks now. The irony was so thick you could have built a retaining wall with it." A few board members, Hemlock noted, looked uneasy, particularly a nervous accountant named Miller, who probably understood the phrase tortious liability all too well. But Karen, fueled by the adulation of her core sycophants, Mrs. Periwinkle, whose prize-winning roses were nowhere near the creek, and Mr. Grumbles, who just hated everything on principle but made an exception for HOA-sanctioned vandalism, steamrollered any dissent. The motion to monitor the situation but take no corrective action passed with a comfortable majority. They were doubling down on stupid. My response was to send another certified letter, this one to the HOA's insurance carrier, outlining the documented risks and the HOA's willful negligence. I also quietly consulted with a friend, a sharp environmental lawyer, just to understand the post-disaster legal landscape. She listened, a grim smile playing on her lips. "Let them hang themselves," she advised. "Just make sure you have enough rope, and it sounds like you're manufacturing it by the yard." The local news started mentioning a significant weather system moving in from the coast. Karen probably dismissed it as more hysteria. I just kept calibrating my rain gauges. The Doppler radar was painting a masterpiece of impending doom across the television screen, a swirling canvas of angry reds and yellows advancing with ominous purpose. The National Weather Service, their earlier flash flood watch, now upgraded to a stark, unequivocal flash flood warning, spoke of significant accumulation and rapidly rising creeks and streams. Karen Henderson probably thought it was just more fake news, designed to undermine her authority over cul-de-sac's petunia beds, or perhaps a personal affront from the meteorological community. I, its most attentive critic, felt a grim satisfaction, the kind a chess player feels when their opponent walks blindly into a well-laid trap. For weeks, I had observed the subtle changes. After each minor rainfall, the water behind their gravel dam crept a little higher, lingered a little longer. The reeds at the edge were permanently submerged, their tips browning. A faint, swampy odor had begun to emanate from the stagnant pool, a perfume of poor decisions. My property, thankfully, sat a few feet higher, a geological advantage my grandfather had cannily recognized when he bought the land. Still, I took quiet precautions. A few strategically placed sandbags, almost invisible behind the old stone wall that marked my lower boundary. A quick check of the French drains I'd installed years ago, ensuring they were clear and functional. These weren't acts of panic, but the calm, methodical preparations of someone who understands the power of water and the folly of underestimating it. My son asked if we were going to have a big storm. "Yes," I told him, "a very big storm, but we'll be fine." He trusted me. It was a trust I intended to honor, unlike the HOA's cavalier disregard for the trust their residents had placed in them. The air grew heavy, pregnant with unshed rain. The birds fell silent. Even Hemlock, usually garrulous, just nodded at me from his porch, a knowing look in his ancient eyes. He tapped his barometer, then gave me a thumbs up. The stage was set. The actors, mostly unwitting, were in their places. The orchestra of the elements was tuning up for a dramatic crescendo. All that was left was for the curtain to rise, or rather, for the heavens to open. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that Karen Henderson's beautification project was about to get a very ugly, very public critique from Mother Nature herself. The first fat drop splattered against my window pane just after dusk, isolated scouts reporting back to the main invading force. Then, as if a celestial dam had burst, the sky unzipped. It wasn't rain. It was a vertical river, a relentless, percussive assault that hammered the roof and turned the driveway into a miniature rapids course. I stood at my back window, a mug of rapidly cooling coffee in my hand, and watched my creek, their problem, begin its transformation. The water, already unnaturally high from their gravel blockade, began to climb with astonishing speed. It wasn't my hand opening the floodgates. It was theirs. They'd spent weeks meticulously constructing their own watery doom. I was merely an observer, a student of cause and effect, watching physics deliver a stern lecture in real time. The gentle murmur of the creek escalated to a frustrated gurgle, then a menacing roar as it slammed against the unyielding wall of gravel. Debris, leaves, small branches, the unfortunate remnants of someone's discarded plastic flamingo, began to accumulate, further sealing the blockage. The water had nowhere to go but up and then out. First, it breached the banks on their side, the lower, flatter terrain that housed Karen's prized petunias and the Hendersons' all-weather patio furniture. A dark tongue of water licked into Mrs. Periwinkle's immaculate lawn. Then another. It was a slow, inexorable creep at first. Then, as the main channel became overwhelmed, a surging tide, lights flickered on in the houses across the way. Panicked silhouettes appeared in windows. I could almost hear the dawning realization, oh dear, the news wasn't exaggerating moment. My own property remained an island of relative calm. The French drains performed their duties admirably, siphoning away the excess surface runoff. The old stone wall, a testament to my grandfather's foresight, held firm, a steadfast boundary against the rising chaos. The creek, my creek, was finally speaking their language. And it was fluent in retribution, delivering its arguments with the irrefutable logic of superior volume and relentless pressure. The gravel dam, Karen's monument to aesthetic tyranny, was now the fulcrum of their undoing. It was, in a purely technical sense, a thing of beauty to watch, a perfectly executed demonstration of hydrological failure. From my slightly elevated and notably dry porch, I watched the miniature Hindenburgs of inflatable holiday decorations bobbing mournfully past Karen's submerged rose bushes. It was a tragedy, of course. A predictable, entirely preventable, and, if I'm honest, grimly satisfying tragedy. Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias were performing an admirable impersonation of seaweed. Her golf cart, parked with its usual arrogant impunity on what was once her driveway, was attempting to achieve buoyancy. It was failing spectacularly, listing to one side like a foundering galleon. The sounds carried across the water-filled expanse. Distant shouts, the unmistakable wail of a car alarm protesting its sudden immersion, and then the rising crescendo of sirens as the first emergency vehicles attempted to navigate the newly formed canals of their subdivision. I saw Karen Henderson, a frantic figure in a bright pink bathrobe, illuminated by the flashing emergency lights, gesticulating wildly at a bewildered-looking firefighter. She was probably explaining how this was all somehow my fault, or perhaps an act of God specifically targeting her azaleas. The firefighter, his expression hidden by his helmet, just pointed towards the source of the problem, the choked creek, now a raging torrent where it should have been flowing, and a vast, murky lake where it shouldn't. My phone buzzed. It was Hemlock. "You seeing this, son? It's biblical. They're gonna need an ark for Henderson's ego." His trail cam, he gleefully reported, was capturing it all in glorious, rain-streaked high definition. "Exhibit A," he cackled. There was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, not of guilt, but of vindication. I had warned them. I had practically drawn them a map of their own destruction. They had sneered, dismissed, and doubled down. Now, the water was calling their bluff. The strategic inner commentary that had been my constant companion for weeks simply observed. Consequences are rarely convenient, but always, eventually, arrive. The surgical precision wasn't mine. It was nature's, aided and abetted by human folly. The deadpan sarcasm I usually reserved for internal use almost escaped me as I watched a garden gnome, dislodged from someone's yard, sail serenely past. Its cheerful, painted smile a grotesque counterpoint to the surrounding chaos. It was a scene of suburban horror, a localized apocalypse brought on not by some grand cataclysm, but by a pile of poorly placed rocks and an overabundance of HOA arrogance. The rain eventually tapered off, leaving behind a sodden, rearranged landscape. As dawn broke, gray and unforgiving, the full extent of the HOA's self-inflicted wound became apparent. Their side of the neighborhood looked like a giant, muddy bathtub after the plug had been partially pulled. Lawns were coated in a slick, brown film. Cars sat at awkward angles, their interiors likely ruined. A grim collection of debris, garden furniture, children's toys, displaced mulch, was strewn everywhere, marking the high water line like a messy bathtub ring. Karen Henderson, her pink bathrobe now streaked with mud, was engaged in a heated discussion with a weary-looking police officer and a man I recognized as a county emergency management official. Her voice, shrill and accusatory, carried across the damp air. She was, predictably, trying to blame everyone but herself: the county for inadequate storm drains, the heavens for raining too much, and, I had no doubt, me, for reasons she was probably still inventing. My property, by contrast, was damp but intact. The stone wall had done its job. The water had receded from my lower yard, leaving behind only a few damp patches and the clean scent of rain-washed earth. The official from the County Water Management Board, a woman named Miss Albright, whose face had seen too many preventable disasters, arrived later that morning. She walked the high water mark with me on my side, then carefully picked her way through the muck on theirs. She looked at the gravel, a solid, compacted mass, still stubbornly obstructing the creek. She examined the HOA's woefully inadequate drainage plan, a copy of which I'd helpfully provided, along with my earlier warnings. She took photographs. She made notes. Her silence was an indictment, far more powerful than any shouted accusation. Crazy Dave Hemlock, meanwhile, was having a field day. He'd already uploaded his trail cam footage to a local community forum under the title HOA vs. Gravity. Gravity wins. Again. The comment section was a predictable mix of schadenfreude and genuine outrage from affected residents, who were just now realizing the source of their misery wasn't an act of God, but an act of Karen. Insurance adjusters began to arrive, their faces grim as they surveyed the damage. The phrase, negligent construction, started to float through the soggy air. The reckoning had only just begun. The next HOA meeting was not held in the clubhouse, as its lower level was still drying out and smelled faintly of mildew and regret. Instead, they convened in the high school gymnasium, a venue large enough to accommodate the unusually large and unusually angry crowd of residents. Karen Henderson sat at a folding table at the front, no longer resplendent, but looking diminished, her usual air of smug command replaced by a hunted expression. The lime green pantsuit was gone, exchanged for something drab and funereal. I attended, not to gloat, but to bear witness, and perhaps to provide clarity. I sat quietly in the back rows as one furious homeowner after another approached the microphone to detail their losses, their frustrations, their dawning awareness of the HOA board's culpability. Mrs. Periwinkle, her voice trembling, spoke of antique furniture warped beyond repair. Mr. Grumbles, for once, had a legitimate grievance: his entire collection of vintage lawnmowers, now presumably residing at the bottom of a silt-filled garage. When the initial wave of raw emotion subsided, I walked to the microphone. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on that quiet guy by the creek. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The weight of the sodden earth, the ruined landscaping, the insurance claims, they spoke with a far greater volume than I ever could. I merely provided the footnotes to their self-authored tragedy. My name is Arthur Davies. I began, my voice calm, measured. For several weeks prior to the recent flooding, I provided the HOA board, including Ms. Henderson, with multiple written warnings regarding the gravel illegally dumped in the creek bordering my property. These warnings detailed the predictable hydrological consequences. I held up a binder. My meticulously assembled dossier of correspondence, photographs, expert opinions, mine, though they didn't need to know the specifics of that, and official ordinances. I outlined how the obstruction would inevitably lead to upstream flooding, primarily impacting this section of the neighborhood, during any significant rainfall event. These warnings were dismissed. I paused, letting the silence amplify the statement. The damage you have all experienced was not an unavoidable natural disaster. It was a direct, foreseeable result of a decision made by your board, against explicit advice and clear evidence. I looked directly at Karen. Her face was pale. I have copies of all documentation available for anyone who wishes to see them, including the HOA's insurance provider, who also received advance notice of this predictable outcome. The moral cost of their action was laid bare, not just the financial burden, but the shattered trust, the ruined peace of their own community, all stemming from a refusal to listen, a stubborn adherence to a flawed vision of control. The only blood spilled was metaphorical, the lifeblood of their credibility draining away under the harsh gymnasium lights. The fallout was, as they say, considerable. Karen Henderson's reign as HOA president ended not with a bang, but with a series of whimpered resignations, first hers, then most of the board members who had blindly followed her lead. The HOA's insurance company, armed with my documented warnings and Hemlock's viral videos, initially balked at the claims, citing willful negligence on the part of the board. Lawyers got involved. It was messy. It was expensive. It was, for the residents who had suffered, a prolonged agony of bureaucracy and blame. Eventually, under pressure from the county and the threat of a class action lawsuit, the HOA, or what was left of it, under a newly appointed and considerably more humble emergency committee, was compelled to act. The gravel, that monument to their hubris, was hauled away at considerable expense. Their expense. Heavy machinery, the kind they'd used to dump it, now labored to remove it, supervised by county engineers who ensured the creek bed was restored as closely as possible to its original contours. It took weeks. The creek flows freely again. The wild mint is already starting to reclaim the banks. My son found a crayfish there last week, a small sign of nature's resilience. They call me Mr. Davies now, or sometimes more quietly, that quiet guy by the creek. There's a new tone to it, respect, tinged with something akin to fear. They learned about hydrological impedance that year. They learned about gravity and fluid dynamics and the fine print in their insurance policies. And they learned, the hard way, about poking a man who simply wanted to be left alone with his water, his land, and the memory of his grandfather teaching him to skip stones across a creek they had no right to choke. The porch light on my house, the one Karen once complained was not the approved Kelvin temperature, now burns a little brighter in the evenings, a small beacon of restored control. The psychological gate, the one they had tried to batter down with their petty regulations and grand follies, is once again secure. There's a somber resilience in that knowledge, a protective loyalty to this small piece of earth that asked only to be understood, not dominated. Sometimes, the most effective way to fight a flood is to simply let your enemy build the dam that drowns them in the predictable and entirely just tide of their own making.